Good afternoon. Welcome back to another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned in to Shooting Landscapes with Telephoto Lenses, hosted by Sony. And for that, we welcome Sony Alpha Collective member Autumn Schrock back for, I think, second time in 2 weeks or in a week.
Yeah.
What's going on? Last time we were on yoga mats. Today we're out in the
Yep.
field and the wild frontiers of the world. And we're talking landscapes today. So I want to send a special welcome to everybody joining us live on YouTube and on Facebook. And remind you that if you guys do have any questions at all, feel free to get them in. You can just drop it in the comment section. We'll get it over here to Autumn. And Autumn, I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
All right. Sounds good. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm thrilled to be here to chat with you about telephoto lenses today. They're my favorite type of lens and are what I use for the majority of my non-astro work. They're so much more versatile than I think most people believe. When we think about landscape photography, we often think about wide, expansive views because that's what we see a lot, right? And that's where landscape photography got its start. I think I read somewhere that Ansel Adams's landscape photos, that he shot most of them on a 35mm lens. And so it's very common for us when we're first getting started to want to include everything in the scene because it's so beautiful and we're so excited and we just want to showcase everything. But as we go wider, we chance making our focal point smaller and smaller and potentially weaker. When I'm out shooting, I usually carry a wide variety of lenses with me because I know that I might stumble upon a really wide scene that demands being shot at 14mm, but I know that I might also come across a stunning mountain that just would look amazing shot at 150mm. And there are probably photographers out there who would say it's an amateur mistake, maybe, to bring a bunch of lenses with you. At least when I was starting out, someone told me that. But I think that's silly. And I've been in too many scenarios. I've said this a lot on the event space, but I've been in too many scenarios where I wish that I had a lens, but I didn't. And those missed shots still haunt me to this day. So unless I've been to the location in the past where I'm going to be shooting, or I've done some research and I know what to expect and what lenses will and won't work, I'll usually bring a wide, a standard, and a telephoto lens with me. And we'll get more into gear specifics in a second. But I personally believe that using different focal lengths is one of the easiest and most powerful techniques that a photographer could employ to take their work to the next level. Because we do tend to gravitate toward our favorite lens. This could be maybe a lens that you feel most comfortable shooting with, or maybe it's a lens that you experience something meaningful through. It could just be the highest quality glass that's in your bag. No matter the reason, I think it's very important for not just beginners, but for established photographers as well to utilize these many different focal lengths. Because each lens has its own unique way of seeing the world. And as artists, being able to understand how each lens is able to see a scene helps us to be better storytellers. It helps us to better convey our emotions and our intentions behind our images, which can make our work stronger. I know it can be intimidating, but it's important to try new things. And I say this a lot as well, but not just in your photography, but in every aspect of your life. And that's a big part of the creative process that I think we as photographers either forget about or deem it just not as crucial, is that experimentation, experimenting and getting out of your comfort zone and trying things that you wouldn't ordinarily do, like maybe photographing landscapes with a telephoto lens. When I was first starting out in landscape photography, I never once thought that a telephoto lens would be my go-to, but alas, here I am giving an entire talk on the subject. So the bottom line is telephoto lenses can completely transform how you see the world around you and how you think about your work. So, all right, now let's get into some gear. But first, what classifies as a telephoto lens? There's, I think, a lot of debate about this, and there's no set rule. So there's no like hard guideline on when a certain focal length becomes telephoto. But I think generally speaking, for full frame sensors, we think like 12, maybe 10 millimeters and wider is more of a fisheye lens, and then maybe 12 to 35 millimeters wide. 35 millimeter to 70 millimeters is like what I would say is a standard focal length. And then 70 millimeters and up would be telephoto. And then telephoto can break down into short telephoto and super telephoto, but some people would probably argue that it starts at 50 millimeters or at 85 millimeters. But for me, I think it's been easiest to think about it at that 70 millimeter mark, because 70 to 200 millimeter lens is a pretty common lens that is very much telephoto. And so for me, it's just easy to use that sort of cutoff at 70 millimeters. So for crop sensor camera, though, the numbers will be slightly different, but it's still a good basis to go off of, sort of that set of numbers. Okay, so the gear that I use, I have the Sony 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 G Master Mark II. This was, I guess, maybe it's tied for my most used lens, maybe. Oh, it's hard to say. But anyway, this is an incredibly versatile lens that allows you to shoot, very wide at 24 millimeters, but then inch into that telephoto range at that 70 millimeters, because you can always crop in further and maybe you're at 100 millimeters then. But this is the Mark II version of this lens, so it's a little more compact and lightweight, which is very much welcome because I'm a petite gal, so anytime I can shave weight in my bag, I'm very, very happy about it. So I love this updated version of a classic. Next would be the Sony 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 G Master Mark II. As well. This is a really great companion lens to the 24 to 70 because you don't have any gaps in your focal length or any overlap. And this is a really great, like primarily what I would say landscape telephoto lenses. You've got some wider or tighter ones that we'll get into in a second that maybe aren't as geared for that, but I digress. This is the Mark II as well, so it is lighter and more compact, which always very welcome. So highly recommend this guy as well. And then we've got the Sony 100 to 400 millimeter f4.5 to 5.6 G Master lens. And I think this is my most used lens. Ooh, it's hard to say between the 24 to 70 and this, but this lens is very dear to me. And I think it's because it's the lens that I initially bought it for wildlife primarily. And then I realized slowly over time that I was pulling it out more and more for the landscapes that I was shooting. And it really opened up a whole world of possibilities for me. And so I think that's sort of why I hold some sentimental value to this lens. But there is, that focal length gap from, the 70 of the 24 to 70 to 100. But because I'm shooting on cameras that have plenty of resolution, I don't have any issues really of needing anything in that range, because I can always crop in on my 70 to make that 85 or 90 millimeter shot that I want. If Sony would make a Mark II of this, I would be very stoked if it was also a little bit smaller and lightweight. But a girl can dream. Hopefully that will come soon. Let's see. So I highly recommend investing in high quality glass across the board, but it's especially important for telephoto lenses. It's much easier to get away with using lower quality glass when you're shooting really wide and the details are minuscule. But as you start to zoom in and you get closer to those details and they start to become the subject of your image, it's much more apparent when you're using that lower quality glass. So I really highly recommend investing in gear that will last you a lifetime. And then super telephoto lenses like the Sony 400 millimeter f2.8 G Master and the 600 millimeter f4 G Master lenses. These are I would say primarily more geared toward wildlife. But, my partner Nate and I, we do have the Sony 400 millimeter, and I would be lying if I said we hadn't, plopped that into the car and driven somewhere to shoot with it, because it is like the sharpest lens I think I've ever used. It's incredible. But not your typical use, I think, for landscapes, because we don't really hike with that bag or with that lens. And then another great option, companion to go with the Sony 70 to 200 is the Sony 200 to 600 millimeter G lens. This one is really great if you do kind of walk the line between landscape and wildlife more frequently, because you have that extra reach, the 600, to get a little bit closer to some wildlife, which is helpful. I don't personally have that lens, but it is on my list of lenses I would like to have, so that might change. Okay, camera bodies. Your camera body isn't necessarily the most important piece for photographing with telephoto lenses, but keep in mind if you are shooting, full frame versus crop sensor, because you'll have slightly different experiences. You'll get a little more reach with a crop sensor, but generally speaking, you'll have lower resolution images and you won't be able to crop in quite as much in post. I use the Sony Alpha 1, which is like top dog, I think. It's the best camera I've ever used. I loved it so much that I bought another one. So literally any type of photography you throw at this camera, it's very, very capable of that, which I love. I never feel like I'm missing anything or that I have issues with anything. It just works. It just feels like an extension of me, which is fantastic. But I also have the newer Sony a7R5, and this camera is incredible as well. I have a little more resolution with it. This is 61 megapixels, I believe, and the Sony Alpha 1 is 50.1. Still, both of them have plenty of resolution, but this one does get you just a little extra. And then it's got the new screen that both flips up and down. Hopefully you can see that, and out to the side, which is amazing. I really hope that Sony will bring this monitor into all future cameras, because it has just been life-changing. I love it. So if I am shooting maybe at 24 to 70 millimeters and I want a little extra reach, I can go into my menu and set my camera to APS-C shooting, which will effectively make my lenses like a 1.5 times crop. So it'll take it from like a 200 millimeter to a 300 millimeter lens. But I don't think this is the primary purpose of that setting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's for when you're using APS-C or crop sensor lenses on a full frame camera to sort of get rid of that vignetting. But it can be helpful for sometimes if you're in the field, it's tough to visualize the frame without actually seeing it. So sometimes I'll turn that on just to see, what will this look like at 300 millimeters versus 200 millimeter. The cons of that, of course, you'll lose some resolution, smaller file sizes. But, I don't really have any issues with that with these bodies. If you're shooting on maybe the Sony Alpha 3 with 24 megapixels, you might run into a few more issues. So I'd be a little cautious with that. But I love having multiple camera bodies because I will often put like my 24 to 70 on one, and then a telephoto like my 100 to 400 on the other one. So this allows me to work more efficiently. I'm faster. I'm not having to constantly switch lenses back and forth. And then I don't have to worry about those pesky, fun little sensor spots. So huge perk of having multiple camera bodies. Tripods and heads. Colorado Tripod Company is the tripod that I absolutely love the most. So I use the Centennial 2 Series tripod from Colorado Tripod Company. It's so sturdy and it's carbon fiber, so it's fairly lightweight. It is, a little bit of a larger tripod, but I use this as like my everyday tripod because I know it's incredibly reliable. And then I use the Aspen ball head, also from Colorado Tripod Company. It's the most revolutionary ball head that I have ever seen, and I'm actually surprised there aren't a bunch of knockoffs yet, because usually on ball heads you have like one little slot that you can portrait mode your camera in, and this thing has like a ridiculous amount of maneuverability. It just like is so incredible, and it's lightweight. It's really sturdy. I can use those super telephoto lenses on here, like the 600mm. I don't have any issues with it. But you know, it is slightly heavier for like backpacking or longer hikes. So in that instance, I'll use the Gitzo GT1545T. Wait, GT1545T. I think that's the product name. Just gonna throw this out there. Not the best product name I've ever heard. But the tripod is fantastic. It's really lightweight and still sturdy enough that I can shoot astro with it. I use the Colorado Tripod Company Highline Mini ball head, or Mini Highline ball head on it. This is pretty small for as far as ball heads go, but it's got a 20-pound load capacity, so I never have to worry about using my telephoto lenses on it, which is fantastic. So this is a really great lightweight like backpacking option. And some settings. I always get asked about settings, but they vary so greatly depending on the scene. But generally speaking, for aperture, you know, I'm usually shooting around sunrise and sunset, which means I need as much light as possible. So I'm often shooting wide open, you know, the widest aperture that my lens offers. Of course, you know, I might stop down 1 or 2 stops just for a little bit more sharpness, but I'm not one of those photographers that shoots all of my landscapes at like f11. I don't know, that's just not really my vibe, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with either way of shooting. That's just sort of my personal preferences, to be a little bit more on the open side of things. And then for shutter speed, this is important for telephoto lenses. Generally speaking, they are more prone to camera shake due to their bigger size and the zoom. So you won't be able to handhold as slow of a shutter speed as you would with, say, like a 16 to 35mm lens. Good rule of thumb to think about is use the reciprocal of whatever your focal length is as your minimum shutter speed. So if I'm shooting at 400mm, I would use 1/400th of a second as my minimum shutter speed. This is, of course, just a guide. You don't have to stick to it. I break that rule all the time because I'm a pretty stable person. So I'm able to sort of calm my body and not move a lot. So I can usually get down to like 1/160th of a second, you know, depending, of course. But I have developed a technique that's pretty helpful in this case where maybe you don't have a tripod and so you still need to have a sort of a slow shutter speed. What I'll do is I'll bring my elbows together to touch, and then I'll rest them on my torso. So I'm kind of anchoring myself and making my body like a tripod. And then take a deep breath in, hold your breath, and then very gently press the shutter. And I've had a lot of success with that method. So maybe you can give that a try the next time you're in some inclement weather, because you know, especially on lenses like the 100 to 400 that extend, they do get caught in the wind a lot easier just because they are higher volume. And then my ISO, I just keep that as low as possible, pretty much across the board. Anytime I'm shooting, I'm trying to keep it just as low as possible. All right, so now why would you even shoot a landscape with a telephoto lens? Great question. You know, aren't they like for wildlife mainly, or like photographing celestial objects like the moon? Happy Moon Day, by the way. Yes, obviously they're fantastic for those ways of shooting, but like I mentioned before, they're incredibly versatile. So literally any type of photography can benefit from using a telephoto lens, and that includes landscapes. So I'd like to walk you through my top 5 reasons for using a telephoto lens. And I'll share my screen here so that we can go through some photos. All right. So number one, telephoto compression. One of the main perks of using a telephoto lens to photograph a landscape is telephoto compression. You're probably familiar with this term, but if you're not, telephoto lenses give the illusion that the space between objects has been compressed or foreshortened. The longer the focal length, the more the background appears to move closer, like seemingly flattening the space between your foreground and your background. So we'll go through some mountain shots first. So for example, we've got this photo of Mount Rainier or Tahoma near Seattle. And if you're from the Seattle area, or if you're familiar with this part of the world, you know that Mount Rainier is not very close to Seattle. It's like a 2.5-hour drive. And I actually Google mapped from where I shot this photo to Mount Rainier as the crow flies. So in a straight line, it's 60 miles away. But that telephoto compression makes it look like it's like a 5-minute jaunt to get to Mount Rainier. So it's squishing this middle ground here, and it's bringing the foreground or the background closer and closer to the foreground. So it looks like it's right behind these shipping docks here, which is a pretty cool effect. It's a really neat perspective trick. And it's what gives that dramatic effect to mountains, or to like the moon, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they just seem to have this more grandiose and epic feel about the mountain or the photo taken with it. It makes it feel more dramatic. And that's thanks to that telephoto compression. Again, here, this is from Salt Lake City, where I currently live. And again, these mountains are, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this area or not, but they don't quite look this dramatic. So squishing this, compressing, I guess I should say, the middle ground here, where these are actually houses back here, but it kind of looks like they're just stacked. Like they're just flat in front of this, these mountains, and then the mountains look like they're just stacked right behind the cityscape here. This is just a wide snapshot from Norway, where I was like, I want to find something here to shoot, but I'm not really sure what I'm going to shoot yet. So I'm just going to take this shot at 100 millimeters and find something. And as I was kind of looking through it, I really liked these mountains over here on the right and how the light was hitting them. But as you can see, that just as an example, at 100 millimeters, they don't look necessarily super impressive, or maybe as impressive as they could. But by zooming in to 400 millimeters, we get this more epic and more grand view of these mountains that just really gives more of a punch. I feel so bad about this example because Square Top Mountain, this mountain, is such a beautiful, stunning mountain, and it looks so puny here. It looks so tiny compared to these hillsides that are next to me. But it's because I shot this at 12 millimeters, which is doing sort of the opposite of what a telephoto lens does. And so it's making this center ground, or the center of the foreground, much smaller, and then it's sort of extending these hills next to me to be larger. And it's really having this effect of not making these mountains look maybe as great as they could. I think it's still, a relatively interesting image. We've got this nice reflection, and we can see the sediment under the water, which I think is always a really cool thing to be able to see. But generally speaking, I think, I would like the mountain to look a little more mountainy, if you will. So by zooming in and cropping, we are effectively, seemingly bringing the mountain closer toward us. And as it fills more of the frame, it gets more of this epic and dramatic feel. This is in Sun Valley, Idaho, at Sony's condo event last year. I hope we get to go to condo again this year. But so this is just a wide, uncropped landscape that I shot at 70 millimeters. I liked that there were some leading lines, and there's some interesting shadow play coming into from the sun going down. But there's not really a place for my eye to rest. I kind of am looking around, kind of hunting for a focal point. There's not really anything for my eye to really settle on, which it can be good and it can be not great. I personally think, it's all subjective, but I personally think having something for your eye to kind of anchor on for a bit helps make an image stronger. So by cropping in, zooming in to 300 millimeters, we get this, the same sort of leading line, leading your eye up and some of that shadow play. But then your eye gets to these mountains and it can kind of rest and it automatically looks more dramatic. We've got even the clouds in the background look more dramatic. I just took these photos, minutes, maybe seconds apart. But just immediately it is more intimate and it's more yeah, just epic at the same time. And then moving into some celestial objects like the sun and the moon. This is a great example of telephoto compression where we know the sun is ridiculously far away, but it looks like it's just right on the other side of the ocean. Like it looks like it's just right on the other side of this horizon. And, we're just compressing the space in between the sun and my foreground, the sailboat here, to give that illusion of this sun being so massive. And the same thing goes for the moon. This was taken in Seattle, looking toward the Cascades, looking east. And the Cascades are not that close to Seattle. And you can tell that because of this atmospheric perspective. There's not a lot of contrast, and there's a lot of atmosphere between these mountains and where I'm standing. But the telephoto compression kind of negates that and makes it look like the mountains and the moon are significantly closer to me, which just adds to this sort of otherwise maybe not super exciting that's what I'm looking for, skyline. It could maybe be an okay skyline, but I think having those mountains and that moon really draws everything, pulls it all together. Same thing, this is a slightly different example where there's not anything necessarily behind the moon or anything to visibly squish in between it, like to visibly compress, but it looks like the moon is kind of on the same plane as the mountain. It kind of looks like it's just hovering there, or maybe it's been erupted out of it. But telephoto compression is one of my favorite things about using a telephoto lens, because you get to see the world
Autumn, your audio cut out on us if you can hear me.
Can you hear me?
And we're back. Yes.
I don't know what happened. That's
It's okay. This is the tech age. We're good.
dramatic.
Roll with it.
Of course. All right. Well, I'll get back to it. Apologies about that.
And we still have audio out now. It went back out on us. We can see the video, just no audio. All right, we're working on getting Autumn back on here. It looks like we just had a flash and it came back on and then it went back out. So apologies for the technical difficulties. We're going to work on getting that sorted out here.
Can you see me and hear me now?
See in here, and I'll hang here with you as you initiate the screen back.
All
This
right.
is our intermission, our unofficial intermission for the day.
Perfect. I literally just unplugged it and plugged it back in. So I hope that works. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but hopefully we're all good.
I think we should be good.
All right. Well, apologies. I'm sorry about that.
Worries. Hey, look, this is what we deal with now with technology. It's good until it's not.
Yep. I mean, wouldn't be using technology if it worked properly, right?
Exactly.
All right. Let's see if.
And we can still hear you and see your screen, so I think we should be good.
Perfect. That's
Awesome.
what I like to hear. All right. Okay, yeah. So I was saying that I think that telephoto compression is one of my favorite things about using a telephoto lens, because you get to see the world in a new way. Like you get to create something that doesn't actually exist because the moon isn't this big, the sun isn't this big, nor should you look at the sun. But generally speaking, it's just really cool because through these telephoto lenses, you get to create this like dream world that doesn't exist, but uses the existing features of our planet to just make something new. And I think that's unbelievably cool. So moving on, number 2, isolate your subject. This is one of the most powerful uses of a telephoto lens from a storytelling standpoint, I think. They're quite effective at isolating your subject from distractions that might pull the viewer's focus away. This automatically strengthens your subject and therefore strengthens your image by forcing the viewer's eye to land like instantaneously right on your subject as soon as they see it, instead of having to hunt around for it. So the telephoto compression can also be a tool to help isolate your subject. Like for example, in this image, your eye immediately goes to the hiker because I've removed all other distractions by zooming in on him, but also the telephoto compression is working to help isolate him. I took this at the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. And if you're familiar with this park, the sand dunes definitely do not look this big or grand. And so the telephoto compression is really emphasizing the sand dunes behind him enough so that it takes up the entire frame. You can't see there are mountains actually behind the sand dunes here. And then also, he's sort of dark against a light background, which helps as well. But in general, that telephoto compression can help you to isolate your subject apart from just zooming in on your subject. I captured this plane flying over the mountains in Norway. In this scene in real life, there are tons of mountains on either side of this mountain. The ocean is right in front of these mountains. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. And I could have kept all of those elements in, but it would have been a very different photo, and it wouldn't achieve the intention that I had behind this photo. By removing the mountains and the ocean, I isolated my subject, the plane, and created an image where the viewer is able to envision themselves, being in that plane and seeing these dramatic mountains from the air. And I wanted to tell this story of this plane because from where I was standing on the ground, I was very envious and I wanted to be in that plane and see what it was like. So I created this. And this is just a wide snapshot, again, from Norway. I was driving around and I saw this mountain and I saw the light hitting it. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to stop. I have to photograph this mountain. And I just had my 24 to 70 millimeter with me. But, as you can see, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of kind of clutter in the foreground. It's not clear that the focus of the image is supposed to be this mountain. It's kind of a broader mountain view, which is fine, but it's not the story that I wanted to tell of specifically this mountain in the center. So I zoomed in and then I cropped in later since I only had my 24-70. And now this mountain feels much more like the hero, right? Because we've isolated it from the rest of the mountains. It's still got these sort of side mountains that are maybe playing a supporting character, and he's like the main actor. But I think it's also important to mention here that you should use caution when isolating your subject, because it can be tempting to frame it almost too tightly when we're isolating our subject. And so I do recommend leaving some breathing room around what you think your ideal frame should be, just so that the viewer's eye will have some room to move around and they won't feel like there's any tension. But then also, when you get back home to your computer, you don't look at your images and go, "Oh man, I wish I had shot it a little wider. It looks tighter here than it did in the field," which is something that we've probably all experienced. So I do recommend zooming out a little bit further than you think you might need to, just to save yourself the headache later on. This was taken in Salt Lake City in the valley here again. And there are mountains again on either side, and the beautiful valley. City lights were on, down below here. And I could have left all that in again, but I wanted to keep it simple. That's a big part of isolating your subject, is bringing in some simplicity and some minimalism. And I wanted to focus on how the saddle of this mountain kind of mimics the curvature of the bottom of the moon. It kind of just feels like the moon's being cradled, and it's sort of this like almost sweet moment. And I think it would have felt very different had I left much more of the frame in. It wouldn't feel quite as intimate. But telephoto lenses can become part of your artistic style. For me, at least, I often get overwhelmed or overstimulated when I'm in incredibly vast or complex areas, thanks to my ADHD. Thank you very much, brain. So telephoto lenses have become a key piece of my work and have tremendously helped me to be able to hone in my focus and to sort of, calm my senses while I'm shooting. And I do attribute a lot of that to my yoga practice as well, which hopefully you turned into that last week on the event space. But so I can zoom in on a very specific part of the landscape and tell that individual story instead of getting overwhelmed by trying to figure out, how to shoot everything. Like another example here where the moon was so delicate that I felt like having more of the frame or more of the scene in the frame would have almost overwhelmed the moon itself, because it's such a simple, very delicate shape. So I just sort of framed it in the middle of this rock in Capitol Reef National Park. This cathedral rock is named the Temple of the Moon, which I felt was very apt. And then using my use of color as well. It's very calming, and it's very kind of just serene as well, with sort of how I was feeling about the moon at the time. And it feels very serene and calming, and very gentle. So number 3, vary compositions from a single location. When you have a telephoto lens that you can isolate different subjects with, this opens up numerous, different doors for varying compositions when you're shooting from the same location. So you can come away with several completely different images that instead of, a handful that feel very similar, you can have you get more bang for your buck, basically, instead of feeling like you can only take 1 or 2 shots at the location because maybe you only have a 16 to 35 millimeter lens. You won't be able to narrow down as much of the landscape as you can with say a 70 to 200 or 100 to 400 millimeter lens. So for example, you probably wouldn't know that all of these were taken at the same location, thanks to that telephoto lens's ability to isolate parts of the scene. These were all taken at Mount Rainier National Park, which is one of my favorite places on Earth. But by being able to isolate, this particular mountain here with this cloud inversion, and then we're using some of that telephoto compression again to make the sun much larger and pull these mountains in closer. And then here, I'm still shooting, I'm inching into that telephoto range, but I did crop pretty heavily on this. So I would say it's probably more like, I don't know, maybe more like 130 millimeters or so. But this feels much like a wider view, but I'm still shooting it quite telephoto. So these are all just feel very different. Also, I should mention the colors are all different, as I was shooting these at different times during the sunset. And then the same thing here, these are actually all taken at Mount Rainier National Park again. And we've got just these varying compositions, which is something that you don't normally get when you shoot wider. So it's just one of those things that's you definitely get more bang for your buck when you shoot telephoto with your landscapes, just because you get to come away with so many more varying images. Number 4, highlight interesting details and new perspectives. We've talked about, telephoto lenses being a fantastic option for seeking minimalism or simplicity in an otherwise chaotic environment. But, maybe there also just isn't a very interesting foreground. Like maybe it's not chaotic or busy or cluttered. It's just, it's not really visually interesting. And so rather than capturing a wide angle view of that, it's you can pick and choose certain elements that you want to include in your image from the landscape to create something in like a new and different way. So this again was Mount Rainier National Park. Can you tell it's my favorite national park? But there's a parking lot that's right below this. And then above these clouds here, there was absolutely nothing in the sky. It was perfectly clear, which is fine, but it didn't necessarily make the image more interesting. And so by cropping in and zooming in on this, I'm able to look at all the textures. You're able to see more detail and the fog, and you're able to see sort of these hints of light kind of kissing the mountainside. And then also telephoto lenses tend to emphasize any like atmospheric things like this. This makes it feel like the whole area was just like covered in this mystical fog in the morning. And in reality, it definitely wasn't that at all. It was kind of just in this small little area. And so by zooming in and showcasing that, I'm able to sort of give a new perspective and highlight that detail in the landscape. And same thing here. I'm not sure that this would maybe be as strong of a composition if it weren't for the highlighting, the sun highlighting this detail in the foreground. So this is Bryce Canyon National Park. And the whole time I was there, I loved this sort of singular hoodoo, where it almost looks like a person because it's got this like larger head up here. And it was pure white, which none of the other ones around were, and it was solitary, which kind of none of the other ones were. And so I was trying to find a framing that would work for this, and I was trying to shoot wide, and I shot some that were a little bit tighter. And then once I got in significantly tighter, I was at 275 millimeters here. The sun like magically happened to just highlight this perfect hoodoo right at the perfect time, and it just really made for a more interesting shot, having these little details highlighted rather than the wide scene, and I'll show you that here in a second as well. But again, I think that this wouldn't have been as successful as a composition if there weren't this sort of hint of light just highlighting detail in the frame. And then that telephoto compression is helping as well, since I shot this at 300 millimeters, to bring these mountains a bit closer, and they look just much bigger and more imposing than they did in real life. And so here's that wider shot of Bryce Canyon National Park. And I mean, Bryce Canyon is a very fascinating place, so that in itself is interesting. But as a photo, it's kind of busy, it's kind of chaotic. The sky isn't really adding too much. Um, and for me, it just feels a little bit cluttered, even though it is really interesting and it kind of looks like these are just like clone stamped, which is really bizarre. But I felt overwhelmed. I felt like I couldn't find a framing that felt good and felt right. And so I just zoomed in completely at 400 millimeters to focus more in on the textures of these very fascinating structures, these hoodoos. And I really loved the color gradients. Like they go from this deep orange to white and then back to orange. And so just by highlighting this sort of different perspective of the landscape, we get to sort of create something new and highlight those details. Same thing with this shot here in Alaska. Alaska. This glacier. It's a lot of gray. There is kind of a nice leading line coming through the frame, but you can't really tell that there's a glacier. You kind of have to look closely, and the details are so tiny that you can't really get much out of the image. So this was at 30 millimeters, and then by shooting at 70 millimeters, I'm able to pull in, we can see all the details of this glacier. And the sky wasn't relevant, wasn't really adding anything. And so just by pulling in these details, you get to create something that's a little more interesting by highlighting those the landscape. And then of course I shot this from a helicopter, so I was above the glacier at an angle, which also adds a new and different perspective. And so thinking about that angle of shooting as well. Number 5, more thoughtful compositions. So, zooming in on a scene means that we're eliminating a lot of different elements from an image. So this makes composition even more important. When you shoot it with a wider lens, you can get away with just pointing your camera at a wide general area and getting a great photo. But it is significantly more challenging to do that with a telephoto lens. So this, it challenges you much more to be more creative and more thoughtful with how you are framing things in your shot. But practicing this, shooting more with a telephoto lens will improve your, overall composition skills and, carry across to all of your lenses, which will just benefit you tenfold. So some compositional elements that I look for in my work are like symmetry, leading lines, scale, rule of thirds, just balance in general, and color. And this is again a wider shot out from that initial Capitol Reef Temple of the Moon shot that I showed earlier. So I shot a few different angles of this and was just kind of playing around with composition and seeing what I liked, but I was being more thoughtful by sort of putting this this arm on the thirds line, and then I love how this the little tiny curvature of the moon kind of mimics the curvature of the rock here, and it's kind of nestled. It feels like it's kind of being kept safe in this little crevice. And then here I was playing around again with that sort of balance where the moon's interacting with this feature on Earth. And the color again feels very calming and very serene, which I think kind of mimics sort of how a crescent moon is often seen as being more gentle. This is an environmental portrait that I shot in Norway, and we've got some nice like rules of third going on here where this giant mountain is kind of erupting out of the ocean on the left side, and then we've got this surfer coming in on the right thirds line, and then the angle of his board is kind of pointing up, even sort of leading your eye up. So we have a few different compositional elements going on here, and it's one of those things where you can get excited and just see a surfer out there and snap away, and that's totally fine, but just being more thoughtful and thinking about how you want to line up things in your image can help make it more successful. Like, so I was waiting here for the surfer to kind of do what I wanted him to do. And of course, you can't make someone do something when you're just sort of observing, but I was able to capture him in a place that I think balanced the image well with this really heavy rock on the left side. This is a wide photo of, we probably wouldn't even notice the moon at first because my eye immediately goes to this giant boulder. So this foreground really isn't doing much for me. It's kind of cluttered. And so by zooming in to 240 millimeters, I get to, I'm isolating my subject. I'm making the moon, hiding in this little crevice here. That's the focus of the image. And I'm sort of creating this like natural frame using the rock around. So yeah, we're just sort of cleaning up, making it more simplistic and being more thoughtful with composition. This is Arches National Park here in Utah, and we've got some balance going on with this kind of heavy rock in the foreground, but it's balanced nicely with this rock on the right and then the mountain in the back. And then we've got this kind of interesting, looks like you're making an okay sign with your hand, which I thought was pretty cool in the middle. And we've got that telephoto compression again, pulling that mountain in. The mountain looks like it's significantly closer to these arches than it is in real life. But that is something I think to mention too, is that I shot this at 400 millimeters, and I think it's tempting when we first get a telephoto lens to want to zoom all the way in on everything because it's reach that we've never had before and we're so excited. But sometimes it's better to pull away a little bit. I think this is a pretty cool photo.
Autumn, I think we lost your audio again.
Are we good now?
We're good now.
Oh my goodness.
I was going to narrate for you, but
Oh gosh.
wait, I think it cut out again. We get a little green flash across the screen and then I think we went silent. At least we have some beautiful imagery to look at while we work through the technical difficulties.
I'm not sure what's going on. I guess I will just try to, hopefully it stays, please.
I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. We can hear you now, though.
I know. Okay. So I think this works better by zooming out a little bit more. There's not really, much clutter to worry about, whereas, that's often why I'm zooming in, is sort of clutter. But this car driving through on this road, it's a nice human element where it feels like, you can envision yourself being in that car, kind of exploring around, which is pretty nice. But then telephoto lenses, they can both increase and decrease your depth of field, which, depending on what and how you're shooting. So if you have something really close up in your frame and your background's really far away, you'll get a shallower depth of field, which means that your background will be more blurred. Or, I typically don't have anything super close up when I'm shooting telephoto. So I have increased depth of field and I use that as a compositional element. So, this car is in focus, the arches are in focus, the mountains are mostly in focus. And so we get this sort of like stacked layered image as well. Well, I'll kind of fly through these to hope that we don't lose the camera again, but this is a nice example, I think, of where there's a lot of unused real estate that's not interesting and not needed. The sky up here is pretty blank. The ocean here is, kind of boring. There's a rod or a stick or something coming up. And so by zooming in, I'm isolating my subject. I've got some telephoto compression going on. I'm, highlighting some details. You can see interesting kind of patterns in the snow on the rock, and then you've got this interesting sort of light beam coming out of this rock. So yeah, it's really good, I think, use of kind of combining all of the reasons that I use a telephoto lens sort of in one. All right, so these are the top sort of 5 things that I'm thinking about when I'm shooting with a telephoto lens. I recommend whenever you're shooting to take some time and just be inspired by the landscape. Like, let yourself be inspired by it. I think we tend to get hung up on like needing to have a vision for every shoot. And that, that comes with practice and that comes with experience. And even then, sometimes it doesn't pan out. So before you even take your camera out of your bag, I highly recommend just sort of scouring, looking at the landscape and seeing what calls to you. And then ask yourself, why do I find this thing so intriguing? Like, what about it is so interesting to me? And then how can I showcase that in the best way possible? This will help you to build up your composition skills and help you to start to create more with intention, which can make your work stronger. Landscape photography with telephoto lenses isn't for everyone, and that's fine. But I do recommend every photographer at least knowing how to use one, even if it's just here and there, because they can improve your eye, can improve your creativity, and in turn your photography. So I hope that this has been helpful and motivates you the next time you're out on a shoot to maybe reach for the long lenses in your bag instead of your wide lenses. Or maybe if you don't have a telephoto lens yet, to pick one up. If you're still a little intimidated by any or all of this, I do teach workshops both in the field and one-on-one in person. So we can chat about anything and everything. You can ask me all the questions. You can check out all of my workshops at autumnschrock.com/workshops. And my partner, Nate, and I, you might know him around the web as Nate in the Wild. We have a joint workshop company together as well. And you can check out all of those workshops at inthewildworkshops.com. We just launched a Moab workshop here in Utah, and we're going to be exploring Arches and Canyonlands National Parks, which are home to some of the darkest skies in the country. And I shared some of the photos from Arches and Canyonlands, and I'm so excited to go back. So yeah, if you head to inthewildworkshops.com, you can check those out. Lastly, huge thank you and huge shout out to B&H and Sony for having me back on the event space. It's an honor. And again, I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties, not sure what's going on. But again, my name is Autumn Schrock. You can find me around the web as Pops. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Autumn, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And especially with a topic like this, I feel like we get stuff stuck in our head. It's like we think landscape, we think wide angle immediately, but it was great to see the difference in some of those compositions where you took the wide and then saw something within the frame and you were still able, it's like there's multiple shots in any shot. And it's always great to work a scene and to, how many times we just take a scene and one shot or one or two shots, or we don't zoom in, we don't zoom out, we don't look at little pieces, we don't dissect an entire scene. So I think it was great to take that approach. And I hope all of you out there are looking into the more of the creative ways that we can see our world around us. I think this just opens our mind up to a different kind of view. So thank you. A huge thank you to Sony, obviously, for hosting. For everybody out there who's watching, now's the time. Get your questions in. We're going to get the party started with Barbara joining us on Vimeo, who's asking, how often do you need a 2.8 versus an f4? We see this all the time. Sometimes you're faced with, I can save some money and some weight by getting the f4 version of a lens. What say you as far as landscape is concerned? I know if somebody's doing event photography, a lot of times you're going to reach for that 2.8, but with outdoor landscape photography, can most people get away with an f4 version?
That's a really great question. And I think it depends a lot on a few things, but for instance, this 70-200, the f2.8 version, the G Master here, it is a little bit heavier. The f4 version is quite a bit lighter. So if I'm, say, like I'm backpacking, I might bring the f4 version over this just because I can save a little weight in my bag, even though I know that the sharpness of this lens is much sharper than the f4 version. That's not always the case with every lens, just kind of the case with this one. But I kind of lean more toward having better image quality. So if you can make it happen, I think the f2.8 version will usually be a higher quality lens. And so I would just lean toward that. But of course, not everybody is capable of that or has those resources. So I think the f4 version is absolutely completely reasonable. And we have the Sony 70-200 f4 version, and we'd use it. So I think that there is a time and a place for both, but I personally usually just stick with the 2.8 unless I'm trying to, lighten my load a bit.
Perfect. Now, Thomas joining us on YouTube asking, what is the elevation on some of these above the cloud photos?
Ugh. Yeah, cloud inversions are one of the coolest things ever. It's just based on temperature changes. And so the time lapse that you saw of the cloud inversion, that was at about 7,200 feet. So not that high necessarily, depending on which part of the country you're living in, but 7,200 feet for that. And then I think the other one was maybe closer to like 6,000 feet. So not that high, but I feel like the telephoto compression and the sort of zooming in on that makes it feel so much more dramatic, like you're almost like in the Himalaya or something, but it's actually not really that high, which is cool.
To us New Yorkers, it's like you guys are like, oh, it's not that high, and you're up the clouds, and it's like, no, like in New York, it's like, no, that's an unattainable. You have to go out to like Utah, up in the
Yeah,
mountains to really get there. So yes, I guess
yeah,
it's subjective there.
yeah.
Now, Ava is asking, Ava joining us from Vimeo, asking, when you're out in the field, are you doing a lot of camera switching? Are you changing lenses on cameras? Are you using multiple bodies and just kind of sticking with one or two lenses?
Yeah, I usually will have two bodies with me, and one will have like a 24-70 or a wider lens on it, and then the other will have a telephoto, like my 100-400. So I can just kind of sling them in both, and I don't have to do as much changing lenses, and I don't have to worry about getting as many sensor spots, maybe, especially out here where I am in Utah, it can be quite dusty, so that's a big concern. So yeah, I'm usually using multiple bodies so that I don't have to switch lenses quite as much, which is really helpful.
Now, for somebody who's taking a trip, say you're taking that dream trip, you may never get to go to this place again. I know the internet, like we have the wonderful internet, which is a great resource for finding out what a location offers. So you can kind of like plan your trip out and say, oh, I want to shoot this and this and this and this, which can help in lens choice. But do you have any resources that you use? Like if you're going to a new place, and it might be the decision between bringing a 70-200 or a 100-400. You may not have the option to bring both. What resources do you use in helping to find the right gear to bring to a new location?
That's a great question. I use several different resources. Google Images, just to look for photos that people have taken. I use Google Maps or Google Earth to sort of get a view. You can kind of scour the landscape and use the 3D mode to see how far away things might actually be. They have like measuring units that you can use to even actually get distances, which is helpful because it can be hard to judge, how far away something is from a photo, especially if you don't know what the focal length is. Then I'll use things like alltrails.com, which is kind of like a hiking trail report website. And there are a lot of great trip reports that people put in there. And sometimes they even will list like the cameras that they brought, or there are tons of photos that people will take. And often they'll like tag their gear, which is helpful. So I'm kind of just like bouncing around to a bunch of different places to see. And then photo pills can be helpful as well, because they also have a distance measuring unit in there that you can see how far away things are. And so, yeah, those are kind of the many different resources that I use for that. And then it's also great if you know a photographer friend who's been there, you can ask. You can even just like search around on Instagram, or yeah, if you have any friends in person, you can ask. That's always helpful too.
See, this is why it's great to have the experts on, because I didn't know that photo pills did that with the distance thing. I use photo pills for the, what is it, the seeing where the moon is at what time,
Mhm.
see if I'm going to be able to see it out my window or not. I'm not
Yeah.
using it. I'm not using the full benefits of it. So
Oh my gosh, photo pills is like, on the surface, it's kind of like, oh yeah, you can check like sunrise and sunset times and the moon and Milky Way. It is such a powerful tool that I sometimes even am like, I'm just barely scratching the surface. But yeah, you can see like from where you're standing, will the moon be behind something that you're seeing, and how far away is it, and what will be in your focal plane? It's just like, it's amazing. Yeah.
All right. I clearly got to dig into that. Next question. Morgan Hayes Photography joining us on YouTube. I love the direction with this, and I'm interested to hear the answer. Really random thought, but have you ever really tried doing a starscape with a telephoto or with the compression? Would the stars just look like blurry dots?
Yes. Well, first of all, hi Morgan. He's coming to Norway with me next year, which I'm super excited about. So thanks for tuning in. That's a good question. So I have used a 400 millimeter lens, like the super telephoto lens, but on a star tracker. So it depends on if you have a tracker that can sort of move with it. Otherwise, you definitely will get star movement, but that might be something that you're looking for. If you're wanting to do some star trails, then that's, something that you can do. But yeah, I've played around with it a little bit. Sometimes, I have a 50 millimeter lens that I've put on, and I've like taken some aurora shots with that. Taken some Milky Way shots that are just a little bit tighter and that you don't usually see. Not quite as telephoto as like, maybe 400 millimeters, but like I've used my 24-70 and taken some shots at 70 millimeters that are kind of interesting. You just have to be careful, with your shutter speed, depending on what effect you're looking for. I don't know, maybe that's helpful.
We're going to let you know. You guys have a long plane ride to discuss it if not.
Yeah.
And our final question here from Sid joining us on Vimeo. Do you use exposure bracketing at all for high contrast scenes with your telephoto shots?
Yes, I do. Sometimes I'll do it manually, where I'll just like take a photo and then change shutter speed or something. But so if I'm doing something where I know that it has to be like exactly in the same position, then I'll turn the exposure bracketing on in my camera. But I actually often find myself just kind of like manually quickly going just to do 2 different exposures, and then I can blend those together later. But exposure bracketing is really, really helpful, especially for any time we're like shooting into the sun, because the foreground will be super dark, but then the sun is so ridiculously bright. So it is really helpful. Yeah, I definitely use that.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to sneak one last question in because Isaac, I don't want to leave you out there hanging. We got those other questions answered. And I will remind you guys, we're going to get some links dropped while Autumn, we'll let you take a sip of water there. Definitely check out autumnschrock.com to see her upcoming workshops, and in the wild workshops.com. If you guys didn't write those down already, write those down. We are going to have this, of course, archived. You guys can go on our YouTube channel at B&H Event Space, look us up there, and we will have this archived version up for you in case you wanted to watch again. But our final question here, Isaac wants to know, what is this compression that we keep talking about? When you talk about compression in these photos, what are we referring to?
Yes, we're referring to telephoto compression, which I'm not sure if maybe you missed that part of the talk where I mentioned what telephoto compression is, but it's this really neat effect, this perspective trick that happens when we zoom in on our telephoto lenses, where the background, I guess from your perspective, the background seems to sort of compress forward to the foreground, which makes like mountains and the moon and the sun appear like it's larger and it's closer to your foreground. So when I'm saying compression, I'm talking about it's sort of compressing the space between your foreground and your background, which is just a really cool thing. And it's not actually happening in real life, of course. It's just a perspective trick that's really, really neat and unique to telephoto lenses.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the effect of compression, or the illusion, I guess you could say, is one of the things that before you know anything about photography from the technical aspect, you see a photo that's shot at like 600 millimeter. I think, Isaac, a perfect example would be to look up photos of the moon rising behind New York City when you see the huge moon behind a building, and it's like, oh my God, how? And then you go out there with your kit lens and try to do it, and it's like, it's Photoshop. It's Photoshop.
Yep.
And the longer you go, of course, the more pronounced the effect is. So that's probably a good way to put it in perspective for those of you who still have trouble grasping the idea. But it's the one thing when you look at telephoto images, you're like, wow, that's really cool. When you're first starting out and getting into photography, it's the cool effect.
That's what I was talking about before, where I love shooting with telephoto lenses because it feels like you get to create something new that like doesn't exist in real life. Like it's just really, really cool. And it feels like instead of just capturing the scenery, you're getting to like create something, which is really, really fun.
Exactly. And doing it in camera is always like, for those purists, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, anybody can go out and you could do anything now, especially in the age of AI. But when you go out there and really just using the physics of the lenses that you're working with, it's really a cool thing. So Autumn, huge thank you. Always great to have you on, whether it's yoga or landscapes or stars or nights, whatever. It's always great to have you on. A wealth of knowledge. And to all of our viewers out there, thank you not only for watching and listening, but getting your questions in and becoming involved in the conversation as well. Of course, Sony, always gracious to them for hosting wonderful events like this. But alas, our time here is done for the day. Huge thank you to all those major players involved in making this production what it is. But that's all we have for today. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space is in the books. Catch y'all
All
next time.
right.